Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Wendy J. Haney. Today I'm going to show you how to make Mary's triangle. Yep, I actually, until recently when I started researching it, I didn't know what this little block was called. But it's called Mary's triangle when you're using 3 fabrics, one for your square, one for your triangles, and one for your big triangle. If you use just 2 colors, these are the same color and these are the same color, so you're just using 2, then it's called the shaded 4-patch. Either way, you're gonna find being able to make this simple and easy a good thing, because you're gonna find it in a lot of different blocks, and it can be really cool even in a quilt if you just make all of these. I'm gonna show you how to make 2 at a time, because most of the time you need to make 2 at a time. What you're gonna need is, of the larger triangle, you're gonna need a square. Actually, it's a rectangle, it's not a square. 4.5 by 5.5. Of our little square up here, you're gonna need a piece of fabric, 2.5 by 5.5. And this fabric, 3.5 by 5.5. I am not going scrappy with this. I'm working with a block that I'm actually wanting the same 3 colors used throughout my block. And so I found the easiest then to do strip piecing. So each of the colors I used, I cut a strip of 2.5, move that up, a strip of 2.5, a strip of 3.5, and a strip of 4.5. And that makes it super easy to do this when you're doing your 3 colors and you're gonna need a lot of the same blocks. I've already cut those up. So I've got my 2.5 by 5.5, my 3.5 by 5.5, and my 4.5 by 5.5. I've got my pins on it because these are like somewhat batiks, but at the same hand, the back is enough different. I need to mark what's the front of my fabric so I don't get them flipped around. We're gonna set the larger rectangle aside, and in this case, we're gonna put the 2.5 strip on top of the 3.5 inch wide strip for our lengthwise. So put them together and you're gonna sew 1/4 inch. And now we have a square that should be 5.5 by 5. What we're gonna do now is we're gonna cut this in half. So we're gonna cut this in half, get everything squared up. I would suggest you make sure that seam is on a line so it's accurate. The seam here should be at your 2.25 inch mark, and then 2.5. Now we have 1 piece for each of our triangle or Mary's triangles we're making. Now take those and we're going to flip them around. We're going to put them on top of each other, and we want our squares opposite of each other. Now put those right side together, and we're going to go sew those together. 1/4 inch seam. So what we've got, once again, right sides together where your squares that you're working with are opposite of each other. Now that you have your 2 rectangles pieced together, what we're going to do is, it's easiest if we open this up a tad so you can see that there. What we want to do is clip the seam between the 2. Don't worry, you don't have to worry about getting too close to this seam here, because that's going to get all trimmed out of there anyway. I just like my little snips here, And the closer you can, whoopsie, the closer you can get without cutting that seam will make, well, guess I need a newer pair there, will make pressing these a lot easier. Then open it up and press it. You're going to want to press away from the squares, because the key thing is you want to be able to see that intersection of your seams right there, because that is where we're going to need to see in order to mark where we're going to sew. This is important for you to actually take this to the ironing board. So, and that's why the closer you can get to, usually the scissor does a pretty good job. It's being annoying right now. Maybe if I turned it around right. There we go. So take that to the ironing board and press it. And then you'll end up with like this. So this one here I had cut really close there. Now what we're going to do is we need to mark so that we have a marking line to know where to sew, because this is going to get eventually cut in half. What I found the easiest is a 45-degree angle ruler. This happens to be a companion angle. And if you put it on your bottom edge of your rectangle here and get it to cross that seam, what should happen is one side of your companion angle is over here on the edge. You've got plenty left here. The other is going to be up here at your corner of your rectangle, and you want it to cross right through your intersection of your seams. And this is why it's important for you to press this way so you can see that. Otherwise, if you press the other way, well, you're not going to have your seams. Then we're going to mark that line. Hold that nice and steady. Whoopsie. That didn't end up where I wanted, as sometimes these markers don't do as good for me as my pencil does. So mark your line, okay, and then flip it over. I find it easiest to flip it over, so I'm right-handed. And then you're going to do the same thing on the other side. Line up along the bottom, get the edge of that angle to cross your seam here in the middle, and the other one should be at the angle there of your rectangle. And yes, depending on your seams, you might have to do a little adjusting. Mine looks, a little off there. We're going to mark that, okay? So now we have two lines here. Now we grab our 4.5 by 5.5 inch rectangle and we put this one on top of it. And this one I pin, because we definitely don't want this thing moving or we're going to have a problem. You're going to take it to the sewing machine, and in this case you're going to sew on the line. Actually, you're wanting to sew like a hair's breadth, a thread breadth to the inside. So sew just on the right hand side of that line, so you've just got it a thread length away from that intersection, and you're going to do that on both sides. And then we'll come back and be able to turn this into our Mary's triangle. Now, I should have mentioned, if you do not happen to have a 45-degree angle ruler, that's okay. Hopefully, you have a ruler like my Omni Grid, which I totally love for this reason as well, which has a 45-degree angle line on it. So that can come in very handy. So in that case, you could put your 45-degree line on the left-hand edge. Yes, I'm a righty, so lefties, I'm sure you can figure it out. You put the top of the ruler, the point, at the top of your corner there. It should be right side on your angle, and then if all is good, ooh, yes, I'm good. I need to fudge just a little there. My line's gonna go right through that intersection again. So, whoops, biggest thing is don't let your fabric stretch. So there we go. So that will work fine if you have a ruler with a 45-degree angle on it. So here we have it. There's my sewn line. Yep, very good there. What we're gonna do now is we're going to trim it up. You could just slap your ruler right in the middle there and cut it, but that ends up giving you a lot extra seam allowance than you need. So I line my 1/4 inch of my ruler on the seam and I cut that one. I flip it over and I do the same thing so that I don't have a lot of extra bulk in my quilt that I don't need. And as you can see here, we now have two squares, and I will press towards the larger triangle. And now you have your 2 Mary's triangle. These should be completely accurate based on your cutting and your seam allowance, and all you need to do is trim off your dog ears after you've got them pressed. If necessary, trim them up. These should be a 4.5 by 4.5 inch square because these are going to be finished 4-inch squares. And yeah, there you have it. No extra wiggle room in this process. This quilt block is often used in very scrappy quilts because of the smaller size pieces in it. In that case, you might want to do this method of cutting your fabric because you'll be able to use smaller pieces of fabric and yeah, use more of your scraps with smaller pieces. I'm also going to be honest with you. The first method and cutting the pieces of fabric to the exact size you need and having a perfectly sized block when you're done has not always worked out well for me. I end up with, sadly, one side that's almost perfect, the other side seems to be more off. I haven't figured out why yet. So I decided this time I'm going to try adding a 1/4 inch to each of my pieces of fabric and see if I can then end up with a larger finished square that I can safely trim down correctly and have a more accurate finished piece. So I will give you information, cheat sheet if you will, to use exact size fabrics pieces and a little oversized to give you a little trimming. And that way you're set to go whichever method works best for you. So now I'm showing you another way to cut the fabrics, but also I'm working with slightly oversized pieces so I can show you how to trim them up at the end, because that will be critical when you're working with an oversized finished square. In this case, we're going with 2 squares to start with. These are your corner squares of your Mary's triangle, and I'm going with a 2.75 inch square. Then our smaller triangles, we're going to start with a 2.75 by 3.75 inch rectangle. And then the larger triangle, we're going to do a 6 by 5. If you were going to go with exact sizing, you'd be a 2.5 inch square, a 2.5 by 3.5, and if I remember right, a 5.5 by 4.5. I will put a note here in the video of the exact size that would be, but it should be the exact same size that we used originally. So in this method, we're going to have to piece our squares onto our smaller rectangles, and we're going to do a 1/4 inch seam. Then, and we're going to press those, I usually press those to, I think, the squares. Press it to the squares. Just make sure you're pressing them the same direction. Once you get those seams in, you're going to bring your rectangle back, and it's going to be just like this. And then you're going to sew these together. Just like before, we sewed our 2 rectangles together, and with our squares opposite, I clipped my seam there, and then I pressed them opposite directions so that you can make sure you see that intersection of your seams. You don't want to press this where you can't see that intersecting seam. Now we're ready to add our marking. Now, with the companion ruler, the one thing different when you're using an oversized set of squares, you want to put the edge of your companion ruler on the left side, keep it straight, and making sure then just slide it up to get it to intersect with your seam there. The difference will be that you don't need to make sure the corner hits the corner of your fabric. That is completely okay. It's going to be off, and I'm going to move that up a little. I'm going to mark this with something that makes it really easy for you to see. So here, I do not have it going into the corner. That is okay because we're running with oversized pieces. If you're using your Omni-Grid ruler, you're going to put your 45-degree angle over here on the left, and once again, get your intersection right there. And you do not need to make sure it intersects with the corner. In fact, it won't, because we're not working with exact sizes. So they're not going to hit the corners like they did with your original sizes when you were cutting fabric that was the exact size you needed. You put it on top of your other piece of fabric, and if it doesn't match exact, I've got a little bit of wiggle room around the edges. Once again, that is just fine because we're working with oversized pieces and we're going to trim it up. I'm going to sew on my lines as I did before, and then I will show you how to trim it up, because that will be the most crucial part of knowing how to trim up your block when you're working with oversized pieces. I now have it trimmed up from I cut them apart and I pressed towards my triangle, and as you can see here, I have nice, good intersection. So we're still doing great for that. Now it's time to trim up. And this is where you have to pay particular attention with using your angle and your square in order to ensure you're trimming up correctly and accurately to get this to turn out. This needs to be an unfinished square of 4.5 inches. I'm going to use my Omni-Grid ruler because I have my angle down the middle, which is going to be that middle seam I've got here. Now, this square here should be 2.25 inches from the seam to the outside and from the seam to the outside. So that is what we're going to use as a basis for ensuring we're trimming it correctly. First thing is I get my line with my seam. Then I slide it down, keeping my angle correct on the seam until my 2.25 inch mark is at this seam and my 2.25 inch mark is here. So that will give me indicating and I want to make sure then that I have plenty of room around the edges because I'm going to trim it when I flip it at the 4.5 inch mark. There's that is 2 1/4. This is 2 1/4. Oops, and I just nudged it. And I've got my angle right. I'm going to hold that and trim it up. Now I'm going to flip it around. Hang on here. I just did that, so we got to flip it around this way. Now, we should be able to put our 4.5 inch on the edges we just trimmed, which should keep our angle accurate. And then it'll be, the line here is 2 1/4. This is my 1 inch at this end. So 2 1/4 here, and from this to this is 2 1/4. And now we're going to trim up our 4.5 inch square. And to make sure it's truly trimmed correctly, this square right here should be, yep, a 2 1/4 inch square. Because we started, well, if you were starting with a exact size, it would have been 2 1/2, and then with your seams on two sides, it gave you 2 1/4. So this means this is exactly the size we need it to be, where this square is the right size, our triangles match, and it's 4.5 inch unfinished. So this method gives you a little more wiggle room. Yes, you're using up a little more fabric, no doubt about it. But if you're struggling to get the size accurate in the other method with starting with your exact size squares, this will allow you to have more accuracy. And when you're putting this in a block where accuracy counts and a lot of things that connect, well, it's important to be accurate. And you'll be much happier with this method. I will put a link below in the description that you can get a spreadsheet that shows measurements of sizes of the two different methods of cutting, and whether you're cutting exact sizes or slightly larger sizes to be able to trim up. And there you have it. And now you'll be able to make an accurate Mary's triangle and be happy with it when you get done. Hope you found this helpful. Take care, and thanks so much for watching.